Every tree has roots, every life has branches, and every adoption has a story. Some stories begin with questions, some begin with loss. All of them are rooted in love and the search for connection. This is Janet Munro, and this is Roots and Branches Adoption Stories, a podcast where real stories take root and grow. Because the more we share, the more we understand, and understanding helps us grow. Now, here's Janet Munro.
Hello, and welcome to Roots and Branches Adoption Stories. My name's Janet, and I'm your host, and I have to tell you that today I am so excited. This could be my first podcast that is going onto an internet radio. It's called KPHRED, K-P-H-R-E-D, and I'm really looking forward to the opportunity that they have given me. But I'm also excited because today I have a very special guest. Her name is Nicole. And Nicole and I became pregnant at roughly the same age. I was 20 in 1969. Nicole was 20 plus years later. We faced the same life-altering moment and made different decisions. So this is not a conversation about right or wrong. It's a conversation about what was possible then and what became possible later. And the question we'll keep returning to is this: how would our lives be different if we had made the opposite choice? Now we're going to talk about the times that we lived in. So before I bring Nicole on, I'm going to talk a little bit about my time. 1969 was when I got pregnant. I lost my virginity on my 20th birthday and spent my summer of 69 working at a fishing lodge on Great Bear Lake in the Northwest Territories in Canada. The end of the summer, we had a big party, and 6 weeks after I got home, I realized I was pregnant. But pregnancy at that time, when you were an unwed mother, your child would be a bastard. You were publicly shame your family. You were hidden away during the pregnancy, so neighbors would not see you, and nobody in the family would know. My parents were lucky in a way because we had come to Canada from England, and all the relatives were in England, so of course nobody would see us. We didn't have internet access, none of this where we could actually talk to our relatives. And I was hidden away. I got to go and live with a family. They had 2 children who I looked after, in that I made them their meals, packed their lunches for school, got them ready for school, made beds, did laundry, all that kind of thing. Every Sunday, my dad would come and pick me up and bring me home, and I would have Sunday dinner with my parents. Luckily, I was able to bring a friend over who broke the ice, because otherwise I always felt that my dad wasn't talking to me. The rides home, the rides back to the house where I was staying, they were all quiet. There was no conversation. I just wondered, it's taken me a long time to realize that my dad, he was disappointed, but was he disappointed more in me or more in himself because of enabling this to happen when he shouldn't have been? But I stayed hidden away, and I had my son on June 2nd, 1970. And to me, at that point in time, adoption was the only respectable option that I had. I had finished high school, worked for a year at an insurance company, went to university for a year. That's when I got the job in the Northwest Territories. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I had no options, no job, nothing. And I'd always said I wouldn't get married until I was 30. And I still believe that at that point in time. So there was no narrative for a single mother with a future. And I wasn't choosing adoption instead of motherhood. I was choosing it instead of being erased and being pushed out. Now, my guest, Nicole, she was in the late 80s, early 90s. And she had a different upbringing and lived at a different time. So, Nicole, I'm going to you. You're the same age, but it was a different social climate. So, can you tell us more about your social climate and how that worked for you?
Right. Regardless of the fact that it was very early 1990 when I got pregnant, um, for my family, the stigma of being pregnant out of wedlock was still heavy. Um, and it was also heavy for the baby daddy's family as well. They were raised Catholic, they were from back east, and she was French Canadian. So she was just north of the border in Maine. And but they had moved to Utah. In Utah, which was the other cultural thing, even though I was raised, my mother was a flower child. So I was raised very much with the whole sexual revolution theme, especially for her. But my dad, because they divorced when we were very, very young, and my dad was more of the conservative, you don't, good girls don't have sex until they're married, and you don't give in to a boy even though that's what a boy wants. And it was a very much a double-edged sword for me. I had a twin brother um, who had already gotten a girl pregnant in high school, and she was sent away, much like you, where she was sent away to go live with other family members, and she lost the baby. And so he never had that responsibility in his life. So here I am, um, a few years after that, and I ended up getting pregnant. And I expected my mother to tell me to get an abortion because she had already had three after she had gotten pregnant with my brother and I. And she was the one who was adopted. So I kind of expected her to be the one to tell me to get an abortion. Surprisingly, it was my father. And that's what he wanted me to do because his excuse was, you're so young, you're in college, you've got your whole life in front of you. And I said, yeah, but I had a conviction that this life growing inside of me was precious. It was a life. And so for me, I wanted to give this life every opportunity. So abortion was absolutely off the table for me. And even thankfully, when I talked to baby daddy and let him know that I was pregnant, it sounds like my situation was very similar to yours as well. We had sex one time. And within 24 hours, I had symptoms, and within a week and a half, I had a positive pregnancy test. So, very strong pregnancy. And when I told him, because of his Catholic upbringing, he's like, you're not getting an abortion. You're not. And so I was thankful for that because I did have that backup with him. And although his mother hated me because she thought I was a slut, um, once my son was born, then and I had decided to keep him, her attitude towards me changed because she knew it needed to if she wanted to have a relationship with her grandson. But she also realized I wasn't who she portrayed me to be, who she thought I was in her mindset. But yeah, so I found out I was pregnant, made the decision that I was not going to abort, which was the big decision because I had a lot of friends in high school that had gotten pregnant as teenagers, and that was the culture that I was in. If you had an unwanted pregnancy, you got married or pregnant outside of marriage, then you just aborted. It was a norm. It was a common thing at that point in time.
And at that point in
Um,
time, it was legal in Utah?
yeah, it was legal everywhere in 1990.
Okay.
It was, yeah, it was legal everywhere. Now in Utah, the interesting thing is culturally, I was born and raised in Southern California, and I moved to Utah on my own when I was 19 years old, not really knowing a whole lot. I had an aunt and uncle that lived up there, um, but I wasn't LDS. I wasn't of the Mormon culture at all. None of my family was. And I knew they were there, but I didn't know a whole lot. So I move up to Utah at 19 years old with absolutely zero interest in getting married. Okay. And because I go to Utah at 19 as a single young woman, I'm considered an old maid because I'm not married and raising babies and being a baby manufacturing machine. I'm just like, no. so so I had these like major conflicts on both sides. It was really interesting. It was an interesting time in my life, but ultimately, I decided to have the baby, but I still wrestled all the way up until he was 3 months old or so, with whether I was going to keep him and raise him myself or whether I was going to place him for adoption because I wanted the best life for him. And obviously I didn't know it was a boy at the time, but back then with ultrasound, by the time I was 24 weeks, I found out that he was a boy. And I just wrestled back and forth with what was the right decision, what was the best decision, not just for me. I knew I could love him, but I wasn't sure I could take care of him the way that he needed to be taken care of. And so, like I said, I had some friends in church that they weren't able to have children. They were married, they weren't able to have children. And we had talked about doing a private adoption with them, between open adoption, but private, between us where we knew each other. And just through a lot of time and thinking, considering all of that stuff, I had to quit college anyway, because if I was going to carry the baby, I was told I was at a higher risk for some health reasons, and the stress levels with college and being pregnant and everything just, they weren't mixing well. So I was told, you either withdraw from college or you are at risk of miscarrying this baby. And so I made that decision to withdraw from college at that time and carry this baby to term. So I did that and went back and forth with this couple and everything. Finally decided, you know what? It may not be a perfect life. It may not be where he's going to be in a household with a mother and a father and, plenty of income and all of that. But with all the friends that I had talked to and all the people I knew who had become parents after getting married and raising children, you're never really fully ready. There's very few people that have a nest egg, set aside and their life is planned to be able to handle the extra expense of this child. You just kind of wing it.
Yes, you do.
So I thought, okay, I can do that. I can wing it and I can love this baby. And I know that. And by that time when I had made that decision and I stood on that decision with my family, they decided it wasn't changing, and they were going to support me. So that also was a help. Even though they were in another state, I was in Utah by this time and they were in California. So I didn't have any close family. My aunt and uncle, I had kind of become estranged from them within the first 3 weeks of being in Utah because their attitudes and their, well, they just had very wild children growing up, and they kind of projected all of that onto me. And it's like, that's not me. And so I saw them at holidays and when my family was in town, and that was it. Now I love I've grown to have a wonderful relationship with my uncle, and he's still up in Utah, but at that time it was strained. So yeah, what was interesting is the couple that I had considered allowing to adopt my child, within probably a year and a half, maybe 2 years of that, they ended up divorced. So we don't know, and the child was not going to make a difference.
No.
She ended up having an affair, and it you can't, a child's not going to stop that. Whatever those issues were that led up to that, it led up to that. And there wasn't anything that having a child in their life would have solved or prevented. So in that case, I was grateful. And it was just me and my son for the first 7, almost 8 years. I
So
went
I'm
through the
going to
whole
throw a
process.
question in here.
Yeah.
You said that your mother was adopted and you had an uncle who was adopted.
Yes.
The fact that they were adopted, did that pay any towards your decision to not
Yes.
put your child up for adoption?
Uh, not to, but I think more that it gave me a fuller perspective of both sides, and I was able to see. My mom didn't talk to me a whole lot about her childhood and her growing up or even her own struggles, but the fact that she had had 3 abortions after my brother and I were born. And then when I got pregnant, she told me, don't get one. Told me that she had suffered some after effects from it that she didn't want me to go through. We talked about adoption, and because I did have some of those conversations with her, and her thing was, I ended up in a great family. I was well taken care of. I got to go to boarding school. I was able to go to college, this, that, and the other thing. But I know there were issues in that too. She just wasn't really open about it. But I at least had someone to ask on the other side, how was it, to whatever degree she was willing to share with me, how was it being the adopted child, being raised, and did you long to know your mother? And that's when she shared with me that she had considered, and it was later that she actually went and looked for her birth mother. And she hired a private investigator, paid money, and apparently her side of the story is that private investigator kind of fell through and fell off the face of the earth after she had paid her, had a few communications with her, and then nothing. So, she felt cheated and whatever. My uncle tells a different story. His story was more that she had the information. She could have gone to find her birth mother. She had enough information. She could have at least searched out her siblings, because she found out she had siblings, but she chose not to. And my uncle, who was also adopted when my mother was 5 years old by a different, not the same parents, different family. And they were both adopted at birth. So both of them, my mother came home, my parents or my grandparents went to go pick her up when she was an hour and a half old and brought her home from the hospital. Jimmy was very similar. So I don't think the birth mother ever saw their child after they gave birth. But Jimmy actually found his birth mother, and she was Hawaiian. So he flew out to Hawaii to go meet her. They had a private meeting, and because of the culture she was raised in, this is 1950, so 5 years after the war. My mother was born in 45. Jimmy was born in 50, the end of 50. So again, his mother would have gotten pregnant at the beginning of 50. He found out that she had gotten pregnant by a military officer, and she hid her pregnancy from her family, from everybody. She placed the baby for adoption, and then she went on with her life. And a few years after Jimmy was born, she met her husband and proceeded to have 5 children with him. He never knew that she wasn't a virgin when they got married, supposedly. I mean, I guess if you're young enough, whatever. But he never knew. She never disclosed that she had been pregnant before, never disclosed that she had a child, nothing. And so it put her in a situation where she chose to keep that hidden from him. She did not want to reveal that and introduce Jimmy to the family. So they had their one introduction, and then I think they may have had one other phone call after that. And then they hadn't spoken since. So
I think that's a shame, but I believe that there are a lot of women out there that are in that same position, that have never admitted what happened to them previously or that they've had a child. I find I never did either. I told my husband, but nobody else knew. And when my husband passed away in 2015, and my dad got sick a couple of weeks later. So then I had spent it every week with my dad until he passed away. But when I was with my dad, I found a letter in a file with my name on it, which was from the adoption agency where my son had, it didn't say my son was looking for me, but they were looking for updated information on where I was. That's all it said. So when I found that letter, I had a starting point to look for my son. And I always knew, I think even after I gave birth, I always knew that at some point I would find him. I wasn't never sure when or what part of my life that would come in, but I knew that I was going to look for him. My husband had been married twice before me. I was wife number 3, and he had 4 children from his first marriage. And whenever they called, they always wanted something. They were always looking for money for something. So if I had tried to find him when my husband was still here, it would have been, what does he want? Because that's what his children, they always wanted something, and he would have expected them to want something, him to want something. So being able to start that process after he was gone made it a lot easier to continue. And it took, I think it was in the January or February that I started that process. My father passed away in May, and then it was the following January, February when I got a letter from the adoption agency saying that they couldn't find him. but this was his name, and that was his last known address. So I was, when you get something like that, I looked at his name and it was Dwayne Tabinski, and I thought, thank goodness it's not John Smith. There can't be too many Dwayne Tabinskis out there.
Right.
And I did whatever any normal person would do. I Googled. All right. I didn't know anything would come from that, but it was funny because it came up. There was a real estate agent in Nashville who had just sold a home to a Dwayne Tabinski, and it came up with that, with Dwayne Tabinski in blue, and I clicked on it and it took me to his Facebook page.
Wow.
And I looked at it and I thought, wow, that's my son, because he said he was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and then he'd moved to Kansas, and now he was in Nashville. And that's how we connected. I sent him a message. He did not respond. I waited a couple of months because my two children from my marriage, we were on our way to Orlando in May. And I thought to myself, it would be perfect. We're driving down to Orlando. I could drive to Nashville on the way home, and it's just a little side trip, right? And I could meet him. But I had to get hold of him somehow. So when I went back to the Facebook, and I think he blocked me because I couldn't message him. But I found the company that he worked for, and I looked for the website, and I was going to send them a snail mail. But there was no address for the company. But there was an email address for him, and it was a Saturday night. And I sent him an email saying, I think you're my son. I'm your birth mother. This is the letter I got from the adoption agency. Attached that letter to it. And I said, if the time is right, we'll be in touch. If it's not right, I understand, because everything has to do with timing. And I said that on the Saturday night, not expecting to hear anything back from him till Monday, when he would go to work and he would read his emails, because that's what I did. But he was in a bar on the Saturday night, and the email went, and he looked at it, and his wife came up to him and said, "What are you doing on your phone? You're not supposed to be checking out your emails." And he said, "I think I just got an email from my birth mom." And she said, "Oh, what do you want to do? Do you want to go home, or do you want to have another drink?" And he said, "I'll have another drink." So that was that. But by the end of the evening, when I went to bed that night, he had friended me on Facebook. And so I knew that he had read the email. And I thought, oh my goodness, what do I do now? It was like I've opened a Pandora's box. What happens? Nobody knows about him. My daughter knew. I told her, but my son didn't know anything about him at this point in time. And the following morning, he sent me an email saying it would be really okay to call. So the way it was worded, I did that. And when I called him, he said, there's three things I want to tell you. First of all, I'm okay. I'm happy. I'm at a good point in my life. I don't need anything from you, but I'd really like to get to know you. Wow, that's a good start.
Yeah.
Second thing he said was, thank you for giving me life. Oh, tears. And then the third thing he said, which just blew my whole world apart, was, you have 3 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren. And that was just something that I hadn't ever imagined, because I was able to hold him when he was a baby, just for a few minutes before they realized that he was being adopted. But because of my age being 21, where it was my decision that it would be better for him to be adopted than to be raised by me, they let me hold him. And all I could see was this little baby. Never imagined that he would have children of his own, let alone great-grandchildren for me. And then I found out through this conversation with him that his first child, the lady who he impregnated with, did not want to marry him. She was marrying someone else. So he put his first child, let the father adopt her, so that he wasn't responsible for her. Then the next 2 children, he married both of those. Why? They both became wives, and he had 1 child with each of them. And then he married a 3rd wife in Kansas so that he could live in the U.S. And then when he moved to Nashville, he was married to his 4th wife.
Oh, wow.
So, and I always wondered, though I never asked him, if the fact that he was adopted had anything to do with him changing changing women, because I'm learning more. Didn't know it back in 1970, but the fetus has an attachment to the mother. And when they're taken away, that they tend to have attachment issues. There's a book called The Primal Wound that talks about that. And I always wondered if he went from wife number one, well, wife number two was pregnant, so he probably married her because she was pregnant. Wife number three, the same thing, because he felt responsible to make sure that they had a mom and dad in their lives. Because though he had a mom and dad, it wasn't his birth parents.
Right.
And yeah, so we connected, and I actually got to meet him. On our way back from Florida, we did stop in Nashville. We said we would come for breakfast because we didn't know what the day would bring. My son and my daughter and her husband and my two grandchildren were coming with me because they wouldn't let me go alone. And besides, they wanted to meet a brother if they had one. We arrived in his house for breakfast. That way, if we didn't get along, we could say we have to leave and drive home. But if we got along, we said it's okay, we could stay. So we got there, I think, about 10 in the morning, and we're standing out front of the house, and we're wondering what we should do. And my youngest grandson said, "You better make up your mind," because I rang the doorbell. And very quickly we had to figure out. So when they opened the door and they came out, he was just as nervous as we were. And it was just hugs and hello, how are you? And we were there from 10 o'clock that morning till 11 o'clock that night. And just had a really good conversation. It was a Monday. It was a holiday in Canada. I wasn't there. And that evening there was a hockey game. Nashville Tennessee Titans or something were playing hockey. And the wife of the real estate agent who had posted about the house, and his wife came that evening. And we were telling them that the reason I found Dwayne was because Cole had posted this. And his wife's comment was, "Oh, that's too much for a Monday." And we just laughed at that and continued to laugh at that. And Dwayne was part of our life for 6 years. We got to see him quite a bit in those 6 years. I went to Winnipeg with him and met the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren. And I met his adoptive mom, who I'm still in contact with today. We had that wonderful 6 years until he was killed in a workplace accident. And at that point in time, he was 53. We were all very saddened by what happened, and life just changed. But, I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity to meet him. I'm so grateful that I had him in my life for 6 years. And I'm so grateful that I got to see who he had become, and that he really loved and respected his adoptive parents, and was happy for the opportunity to meet me. And I still keep in touch with the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren, and life goes on. But now we get back to you. So you have your child, and you're raising the child, being a single mom. And you said you had the support of your family, right? Because once my child was born, my parents never, ever asked me anything about him ever again.
Oh, wow.
Until my dad got that letter from the adoption agency and giving me the number to call them to let them know where I was.
Wow. Yeah, it wasn't, like the close up support, because, like I said, we lived in different states, but the emotional support. And the year, let's see, Daniel was born in December of 1990, December 7th, 1990, Pearl Harbor Day. Interestingly enough, World War II is like his favorite thing. His favorite. He always loved history, World War II. I mean, he takes his birthday quite seriously. But that year, my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, the adoptive father of my mother, ended up going into the hospital, and he passed away by the time Daniel was 3.5 months old. Um, Having my own child came with its challenges. I ended up with postpartum psychosis and in the hospital for 2 weeks. Um, Lost my son somewhere along the way because a friend of mine was supposed to be watching him and abandoned him. And uh, my landlord had to contact another friend of mine. Anyway, this whole process, it's like he just disappeared for a while, and that freaked me out. And they made me stop talking on the phone. And I'm like, this is an infant. He's 3 months old. He's totally helpless. And you're telling me not to worry about it. This is ridiculous. But I was confined to the hospital. They wouldn't let me leave because, like I said, I had some suicidal and homicidal things. And they're like, yeah, your hormones are way out of whack. You're not going anywhere. Sorry, you're staying here. So I was in the hospital for 2 weeks, and at the end of that 2 weeks, near the end of it, was when I got the call from my grandmother in California that grandpa had pneumonia, and his cancer, he had cancer before. He had emphysema. He had struggled with emphysema for years because he had been a real heavy smoker for over 60 years. And then finally quit. But the emphysema had already, the lungs had already been affected and everything. So I got the call that he was in the hospital and he probably wasn't coming out. My aunt and uncle were going to be driving down to see him and wanted to know if I wanted to ride down with them, with Daniel. And we had found him by then. So this is my dog, Luna. Sorry. Okay.
It's all right.
She's like, Mommy.
That's what's part of it.
She's my baby. So we ended up driving down to California, and I got to go see my grandfather, whom my grandparents, that grandfather, and my big crazy story, but my mom's dad married my dad's mom when my brother and I were a year and a half old. So it made my mom, my aunt, my dad, my uncle, my brother, my cousin.
All right.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy. Anyway, second marriage, all that stuff. But so anyway, they had actually raised my brother and I for a while. We lived with them for a while when we were growing up in fifth grade and different things like that. Spent every summer, with them, a week after Christmas with them. They were very much a part of our lives. So my grandfather, who was my favorite grandfather, he was dying. So we ended up going and seeing him in the hospital, and we took Daniel so that he could see Daniel and my baby, my boy. And he saw my boy, and I'm going to say this without crying. Daniel was always Daniel. No one was allowed to call him Danny or Dan or anything like that. Daniel was his name. My grandfather called him Danny Boy, and he was the only one allowed to call him Danny Boy or anything other than Daniel. And he saw him, and he said, "He's so beautiful." And that, I didn't understand the impact of that until I got home that night with my grandmother, because I was staying with her. And she said, "You have no idea. Your grandfather has seen many babies in his lifetime." He was 84. He has never called a baby beautiful, ever. Not his own children, not my brother and I when we were little. No baby. None of his other grandchildren, great grandchildren, nothing. My son, his great grandchild from his daughter, is the first baby he ever saw and said that baby was beautiful. So that was really precious to me, and that he was able to see Daniel and to see that extension of his legacy, his life, for what he had done for my mother by adopting her and bringing her into the family. And then my brother and I were born, and then and life goes on because it's still a part of that family legacy. And it was, yeah, anyway, my grandfather passed away that April. It was April 16th. So Daniel was just 4.5 months old by the time my grandfather passed away. And I spent a lot of time after he passed. I spent a lot of time going back and forth to California. So the fact that my parents did support me, my grandmother did support me emotionally, allowed me to go down there. And I spent a lot of time, that first 7 years of Daniel's life, I spent a lot of time driving back and forth to California. Even when I was working and stuff, my vacations were down there. My dad and my stepmom actually spent time raising him for me. They would take him for a month at a time. And they had horses. My brother was down there, my stepbrother. At the time, my twin brother was still alive, so he was down there. And they got to be a big, huge part of his life. And back in Utah, he was with his paternal grandparents every weekend, or at least every other weekend, because his grandfather, his dad had gone into the Marines, and so he was stationed in San Diego for a long time, and then 29 Palms. But his parents, because we lived so close by, I would take them over there all the time. By the time he reached 5 years old, he was allowed to go to the museum. His grandfather was retired Air Force, and he volunteered over at the Hill Air Force Base Museum, and he did helicopters. He took care of all the planes and everything on Saturdays. So by the time Daniel was 5, he would go to the museum with his grandfather, and his grandpa would give him a rag, and he'd have him clean the inside of the cockpits on the planes and in the helicopters and everything. So he would be wiping down the inside of the canopy and wiping down the tools and all that stuff. And so he grew up in all of that, which helped him also with his love for history and for, war history and everything, because his grandfather was a Vietnam veteran. And so there's a lot of that in him. And it was just a joy. It was good for me, because for me, it affirmed that I had made the right decision to allow him to be a part, to keep him in my family, in my life. And he got to bless my family, my dad and stepmom. Oh my gosh. They were just tickled pink. He's the first grandchild in the family. And so they were just tickled pink to get to have him be a part of their life.
So you had great support from all your family, but how was it being a single mom from everybody else's perspective, from friends, or when he started going to school and you were a single mom? Was there a stigma to that?
A lot of my friends said, gosh, that must be so hard for you being a single mom and all of this. But I had nothing to compare it to. Most of the women that I knew who were single moms had been married. There were only a handful, and I mean like maybe 3 of us total and I knew a lot of people. So in a big circle, there was 2 or 3 of us that had children outside of wedlock. I was the only one who didn't go keep having more. I just, I, I chose not to live that lifestyle, did not want that lifestyle, didn't want to do that to my son. I didn't have a revolving door on boyfriends. Um, that was very much, it's like, okay, I made that mistake. I don't want to do that. I want to focus on him and focus on our life together. Uh, and because I had that support. Now, I'm not saying I didn't date a couple of times while he was little. I did. Um, they didn't work out. The man I did end up marrying, I had known for 6.5 years, and I had helped his son from his first marriage and my son were exactly 10 months apart. So they were like best friends. They hung out together, they played together, and that's kind of how the relationship, I guess, developed. And he had been a part of our friend group. That was not the wisest wedding marriage decision I made. Just saying.
Okay.
There were a lot of things, unfortunately, done behind closed doors that I could not see prior to marrying him. But and I regret it in many ways, but I have to choose not to live in the regret because it ended up driving a wedge between my son and I. Right after we had gotten married, he was pretty much, it was, I'm not competing with your son for your attention. And that, I wish I could have just like stopped it then, you know, but I didn't. And that marriage lasted, I pushed through 10.5 years with that marriage, constantly hoping things would get better, things would get better. I kept trying to change myself because I knew I couldn't change anybody else. And yeah, that ended up being a mess. But anyway, um, that same husband at that time, now ex-husband, unfortunately is the one who has drawn that oldest son away from me, along with my daughter. And that whole dynamic and situation, it was not healthy. And if I could take it back, I would, but I can't. And I did get my daughter out of it, and I did get my youngest son out of it. And I love those. I love all of my children. I love them. I adore them. They have each played a significant role in who I've become, how I've matured. Hopefully, I was able to sow some good things into them as well, regardless of the choices that they've now made as adults and the perceptions they've chosen to believe. You know, we all go through that. We all have these times where we want to blame other people for our woes in life. And it takes some maturity to realize, no, I made some decisions. I made some decisions that have consequences and have long-term consequences. And, you know, I have to live with those. But do we live and we grow and we rejoice for those moments, those times, those years that we did get to be with them and they did get to be a part of our lives? Or do we live in regret?
We can't live in regret,
No,
and we can't change the past.
no.
We just have to look to the future. So when it boils down to you and I didn't raise my son, but I did know him, and letting him change the rest of my life.
Yes.
For you, you've raised your son, you created a blended family, um, and now you've got that distance between yourself and your son, right?
Mm-hmm.
What did you imagine your relationship would look like, and how does it differ from the reality?
Daniel and I were so close, and I know I made mistakes growing up. Being a single parent has a lot of stress. trying to play both roles, trying to balance things out. And he got the brunt of a lot of ugly when I was growing up, even though, I was in my 20s. I was 21 when I had him, 2 weeks before I turned 22. I was 28 before I got married. And it was actually almost 29. So we had a lot of time together and a lot of bonding. And I never thought I wouldn't have him in my life. But here we are. He has 4 children. I do not get to be grandma. My daughter doesn't want children. And my youngest is only 25, and he has no interest in dating anybody right now. He got his heart broken a few years ago, and he's just not been interested in looking anywhere else. So, and that's fine. That's his choice. I do have a relationship with my youngest, and I am grateful for that. My daughter has been on again, off again since she was 15 years old. So I just kind of let her go through her thing. And I understand the turmoil that can happen. They don't know what I walked through, and they wouldn't even be able to conceive or see it from my point of view because they had such a different upbringing than what I had, than what I experienced. And that's fine. Like I said, we all have our choices to make. I had thought about, and like we've said, you can't change the past, but I had often wondered, especially after he chose to walk away, what life would have been like if I had placed him for adoption. And would he have come looking for me, or would I have been able to go looking for him? If I had carried through with that open adoption, would I still be a part of his life? Would I not? All of these things, they're questions we don't have answers to. And we cannot have answers to because we can't turn back history. We can't go back and change the choices that we made. So I am hopeful that someday he will decide that a relationship with his mother is important, and that he will want his children to have a relationship with their natural grandmother. But I don't know.
Well, we assume that different choices would have spared us the pain that we went through. But pain finds us no matter what, right? Just wearing a different face.
Yep.
So our stories don't prove that one decision is better than another. They prove that women make choices inside the boundaries of their time. What looks like freedom today was unthinkable yesterday. And what we call choice is often shaped by shame, silence, or support. The question isn't, what should she have done? The question is, what did she have permission to do? If there's one thing our stories share, it's this. Love was present in both decisions, and love, no matter the path, always leaves a mark. So thank you for joining us on Roots and Branches today. Look forward to seeing you next time. I'm Janet, and again, thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Roots and Branches, Adoption Stories, where every tree has roots, every life has branches, and every adoption has a story. Got an adoption story you want to tell? Want to learn more about adoption stories? Then visit rootsandbranchesadoptionstories.com.